This is my true story. I worked, saved, and sacrificed so my only son would never struggle the way I did. I gave him everything: the house, the name, the future. I thought he would care for me when I grew old, the same way I once carried him in my arms. But one day, I collapsed, and the person I loved most left me in a hospital bed like a forgotten thing. For 3 days, no call, no visit, no care. I learned what I truly meant to him. But you won't believe what I did next. Before I tell you what I did next, please comment where you're watching from and subscribe so my story can reach more people. It started on a quiet evening. I was sitting in my chair after dinner watching the news when suddenly everything around me blurred. My chest tightened like a fist was crushing my ribs. I tried to call for help, but my voice barely came out. My son was home, scrolling on his phone in the next room. I managed to bang on the table, and he came running, annoyed at first, thinking I had dropped something. When he saw me clutching my chest, his face turned pale. He grabbed his keys and helped me to the car. I thought maybe, finally, I'd see the son who cared, the one I raised with love and sacrifice. The drive to the hospital felt endless. My breath came in short bursts, my vision dimmed. He said nothing, just stared at the road, impatient, tapping the steering wheel. When we reached the hospital, he helped me through the paperwork, signed a few forms, and told the nurse he'd come back after parking the car. But he didn't come back. Hours passed. Nurses came and went. Machines beeped beside me. My chest burned like fire, and my hands shook as I reached for my phone. No missed calls, no messages. My son, my only son, was gone. That first night was the longest of my life. I lay there, weak and confused, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of other patients talking to their families. Laughter, concern, footsteps, all the sounds of love. But for me, there was only silence. The nurses asked if they should call someone, but I said no. I was still defending him, even in his absence. I told them he was busy with work, that he'd come tomorrow. I believed my own lie because the truth was too painful to say out loud. The next day, I waited again. Every time footsteps approached my door, my heart lifted. But it was never him. The nurse said no one had called to ask about me. I checked my phone again and again, hoping for a text, something, anything, nothing. The food tray stayed untouched. The medication dulled the pain in my chest, but it couldn't touch the one in my heart. I felt like a child waiting for a parent who had forgotten him. By the 3rd day, I stopped waiting. I told the nurse to discharge me once I was stable. She looked at me with pity, and that hurt more than the illness. Pity meant she knew what I refused to admit, that I was alone. I spent that day staring out the hospital window, watching other families come and go. Sons helping fathers into cars, daughters holding hands, grandchildren carrying flowers. All I had was a folded hospital gown and a bill I could barely read through the blur of tears. That evening, when the doctor came in to check my vitals, he asked, "Is your son coming to pick you up?" I wanted to lie again, but my throat closed up. I just shook my head. He sighed, patted my shoulder, and said they would call a taxi for me when it was time. I turned my face away so he wouldn't see the tears. The man who had given his life to raise a child was now leaving the hospital in a stranger's cab. When they finally discharged me, I sat in the taxi with my discharge papers on my lap. The driver looked at me through the mirror, asked if I had someone waiting at home. I said yes, though I knew no one was. The streetlights blurred as we drove through the city, and I realized how small I felt, a father forgotten by his own blood. By the time we reached the house, I wasn't angry anymore, just empty. I paid the driver, walked up to my front door, and stood there for a long moment before opening it. The house was dark, silent. It didn't feel like home anymore. It felt like a museum of memories that no longer belonged to me. I sat on the couch, clutching my chest again, not from pain, but from a deep ache that no medicine could cure. That was the moment I knew something inside me had changed forever. My love for my son was still there, but it had hardened into something cold, something that would soon make me do the one thing I never thought I could. The first night back home was worse than the hospital. The silence felt heavier, almost alive, pressing against my chest. I waited for the sound of the door opening, for footsteps, for his voice calling out to check on me. Nothing came. The clock ticked, the fridge hummed, the world went on without him. I told myself maybe he was busy, maybe something urgent came up, but deep down, I already knew the truth. He simply didn't care enough to come. When morning arrived, I tried to move like nothing happened. I made tea, but it tasted like ash. I looked at the empty chair across the table, the one he used to sit in when he was younger, eating cereal and talking about school. Back then, he would look up at me with pride. Now, that same chair was just a reminder that I had raised a stranger. 3 days in the hospital, alone. 3 nights of waiting, praying, defending him in my head. I kept replaying every moment of his childhood. The scraped knees I bandaged, the nights I stayed awake when he had a fever, the times I skipped meals so he could have enough. Every memory felt like a betrayal now. I gave everything, and he gave me silence. The neighbors found out I was home. Mrs. Lopez from next door brought soup. She asked if my son had been by to pick me up. I smiled weakly and lied, said he was out of town. Her face softened with pity, and I hated that look. I didn't want sympathy. I wanted my son to show up, to care. But he didn't. Even pity from strangers felt warmer than his love. That evening, I checked my phone again. There was one message, from him. Just 6 words. "Hope you're feeling better, Dad." No visit, no call, not even a question about how the tests went. He couldn't even spell out, "I'm sorry." That small text broke something inside me. It was cold, distant, like a note to a coworker, not to a father who almost died. I spent the next few days trying to forgive him. I told myself maybe he was scared. Maybe seeing me sick reminded him of death, and he didn't know how to handle it. But then I remembered the smirk on his face when he once told his friends I was too old to keep up. That wasn't fear. That was pride, the kind that turns love into shame. By the 4th night, I stopped pretending. I realized I was just another obligation he wished would disappear. The son I had once been proud of had turned into a man who measured worth in money, not love. And since I had little left to give him, I had become worthless in his eyes. I went into his room and looked around. It was spotless. He hadn't lived there in years, but I had kept everything. His trophies, his posters, the toy car I bought him when he turned 10. I sat on the edge of his bed and felt the tears come, slow and heavy. Not the tears of sadness, but of final understanding. A father can love his child endlessly, but if that love isn't returned, it becomes a wound that never heals. The next morning, I took his childhood photo from the shelf and stared at it for a long time. His smile looked pure, innocent. I whispered to the picture, "Where did you go, my boy?" The child I raised was gone. The man who replaced him had my blood, but not my heart. That was the moment I made my decision. I wouldn't beg for love anymore. I wouldn't wait for a son who forgot what family meant. I was still alive, barely maybe, but alive enough to make one last choice. If he could abandon me like a stranger in a hospital, I could teach him what being left behind truly felt like. The next day, I called my lawyer. I didn't tell anyone. My son had turned his back on me when I needed him most. Now, I was going to turn the page on him forever. That morning, after calling my lawyer, I sat by the window for hours. The sunlight came through the curtains, but it didn't warm me. I stared outside, thinking about the years I had wasted believing love was permanent. I used to tell myself that blood meant loyalty, that no matter how cold the world became, family would never leave you behind. I was wrong. Family isn't always who you raise. Sometimes it's who stays when everyone else walks away. As I sat there, memories came flooding back like cruel jokes. I remembered the first day I carried my son home from the hospital. He was so small that I was afraid to hold him too tightly. I worked endless shifts just to buy him milk and clothes. When his mother died, I promised her I would raise him right, that I would give him the world. And I did, at the cost of my own life. I skipped meals, took loans, and worked myself to the bone so he could go to college, so he could live comfortably. I thought one day he'd look back and say, "My father gave everything for me." But instead, he forgot me the moment he didn't need me anymore. Lying alone in that hospital bed had shown me what love really means. It isn't about words or promises. It's about who shows up when you're too weak to stand. And he didn't. He left me surrounded by machines and strangers. That image haunted me. I could still hear the nurse asking if someone was coming for me. I could still see the pity in her eyes. I wasn't a patient that day. I was a man whose own child had erased him. For years, I had ignored the signs, the short answers, the cold stares, the way he treated me like an obligation instead of a parent. I told myself he was just busy, that work was hard. I defended him to everyone, even when he made excuses not to visit. I refused to see what was in front of me, that the boy I raised had turned into a man without empathy. The hospital incident didn't change him. It revealed him. I went into my study that afternoon and opened the drawer where I kept our family photos. There were dozens of them, birthdays, graduations, holidays. In each one, I saw myself smiling proudly beside him. But the older he got, the more his smile faded. By the last few photos, he wasn't even looking at me. He stood there like I was just another old man in the frame. I realized then that love can die long before the person does. As I looked through those pictures, something hardened inside me. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel guilt. I didn't feel doubt. I felt clarity. My entire existence had revolved around a son who wouldn't even look back. The pain that used to crush me now felt clean, sharp, but freeing. He had abandoned me, and now I would return the favor. The lawyer came that evening. We sat in silence for a while before I handed him the documents. I told him exactly what I wanted. Everything transferred out of my son's reach. The house, the land, the savings, all of it. The lawyer hesitated, asked if I was sure. I said yes. I told him I had made my peace. The house that once held laughter now only held ghosts. I wanted it to go to someone who at least knew the value of loyalty. After he left, I stood in the living room and looked around. The walls were covered with memories. Drawings from my son's childhood, family portraits, awards he'd won. I touched them one by one, knowing it would be the last time. I wasn't doing this out of spite. I was doing it out of truth. I had learned the hard way that love without respect is slavery. And I was done being a prisoner of hope. That night, I slept better than I had in years. For once, I didn't dream about the past. I didn't wait for a phone call that would never come. I was no longer a father waiting for a son's affection. I was a man reclaiming his dignity. The realization was simple and cruel. Love given to the wrong person is just self-destruction. And I had finally stopped destroying myself for someone who had already buried me in his heart. When I returned home from the lawyer's office, the air inside the house felt different. Heavy. The same walls that once echoed with laughter now whispered regret. Every step I took sounded louder than it should. The floors creaked as if the house itself knew what I had just done. I closed the door behind me and looked around at the emptiness I had built with love that was never returned. The smell of dust and old wood filled the air. It had been days since anyone had been there except me. I sat on the couch and stared at the family portraits hanging on the wall. Each face smiled back at me, frozen in time, pretending nothing ever went wrong. The curtains were half open, and the sunlight hit the frame of my late wife's picture. I remembered the promise I made to her on the day she passed, that I'd protect our son no matter what. I had kept that promise longer than I should have. I protected him even when he didn't deserve it. I defended him when people said he was selfish. I paid his debts, fixed his mistakes, and forgave his carelessness. But sitting in that quiet room, surrounded by the ghosts of old promises, I realized something cruel. I had protected him so much that I had forgotten to protect myself. I walked to his old room again. The bed was still neatly made, the air stale from disuse. His childhood things were still there. The same baseball glove, the same trophies, the same medals he once showed me proudly. I touched them, one by one, as if maybe they could remind me of the boy who once called me his hero. But all I felt was distance. That boy was gone long ago, replaced by a man who only saw me as an obstacle. I went to the kitchen and made a cup of tea, but even that small comfort felt empty. I poured it down the sink and stared out the window. The garden outside was overgrown. The flowers my wife once planted had withered, just like everything else she left behind. My son used to play there when he was little. I could still see the image in my mind, him running around with a stick pretending it was a sword, laughing, calling me to join him. Back then, I thought I had everything. I thought the love we shared was unbreakable, but love without gratitude dies quietly. It doesn't explode, it fades like a slow disease. That night, I sat on the porch with a blanket around my shoulders. The sky was clear, and the stars looked almost cruel in their beauty. I thought about the last conversation I had with my son before the hospital. He had complained about bills, about work, about how tired he was. I had tried to speak to him about my health, but he had brushed it off. He told me he didn't have time for old man worries. Those words had stayed with me. Now they echoed louder than ever. I took the house papers from my coat pocket and placed them on the table beside me. It was done. The house was no longer mine. Soon it would belong to someone else, someone my son despised. It was a cruel decision, yes, but so was being left alone in a hospital bed for 3 days. I didn't do it out of revenge. I did it because I finally saw the truth. The son I raised had turned his back on me long ago. I was just catching up to what was already real. Before I went to bed, I walked through every room in the house one last time. The living room, the kitchen, his bedroom, mine. I touched the walls, the doors, the memories. Each one felt like a goodbye. When I finally lay down, I stared at the ceiling until my eyes burned. I didn't cry. I didn't feel guilt. I only felt peace. The kind that comes after pain has nothing left to take from you. I whispered to the dark. This house gave him everything. Now, it will teach him what nothing feels like. Then I closed my eyes, ready for whatever came next. That night I didn't sleep. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, the ticking clock beside my bed marking every second of the silence my son had left behind. The house was dark except for the faint orange glow of the streetlight seeping through the curtains. I thought about the hospital again, the machines, the smell of medicine, the sound of footsteps in the hallway. I remembered lying there, thinking my son would walk through the door any moment, but he never came, and that thought hardened inside me like stone. That was the moment I decided. If he could leave me to die alone, he didn't deserve to live off what I built with my blood. I sat up and switched on the lamp. The papers were still on the table beside me. The property deeds, the savings account details, the business shares, everything I owned. My hands trembled as I looked at them. I wasn't angry anymore. I was tired. Tired of hoping, tired of forgiving, tired of being invisible in a life I had sacrificed everything to build. People say forgiveness makes you free. They're wrong. Forgiveness without respect is just surrender. And I had surrendered long enough. In the quiet, I thought of everyone my son had stepped on to get ahead. The workers he mocked, the friend he betrayed, the rival he hated. That rival. He was the only man who ever helped me when things went bad. Years ago, when my business almost collapsed, it was that man, my son's so-called enemy, who lent me money without interest, just to help me stand again. My own son laughed at me for taking his help, called me weak, said I was too soft. He never understood that real strength comes from loyalty, not pride. And now that same man would become the heir to everything my son thought he would inherit. I got out of bed and made tea. The house was silent except for the sound of the kettle. I sat at the kitchen table and watched the steam rise, thinking about all the nights I had sat in that very spot waiting for my son to come home. Every time he was late, I'd worry. Every time he didn't call, I'd stay awake until I heard his car. That kind of love, the kind that keeps you alive through pain, had turned into poison. And now I was ready to drain it from my life once and for all. In the morning, I called my lawyer again. He came over by noon, quiet and serious. I told him I wanted to make the transfer final, immediately. No delays, no second thoughts. He looked at me for a long time and asked if I was sure. I said I'd never been more certain of anything. I told him, sometimes the cruelest thing a parent can do is teach their child what love really costs. He didn't argue. He just nodded and began drafting the final documents. When I signed the papers, my hands didn't shake. The pen moved smoothly, as if even my body was done carrying the weight of disappointment. The house that once belonged to me was now his, the man my son despised. A rival by title, but a better man than my own blood. The lawyer folded the documents, handed me a copy, and said quietly, "It's done." I thanked him, though I don't remember the sound of my own voice. After he left, I sat outside on the porch again. The wind was cold, sharp against my face. For the first time in years, I didn't feel helpless. I felt in control. My decision wasn't born from revenge. It was born from truth. My son needed to understand that love is not a guarantee. It's earned, and once lost, it cannot be bought back with tears or excuses. I had forgiven him too many times, and all it did was make him crueler. He left me to die alone, believing I'd still be here when he needed something. Now he would learn what gone really means. That evening, I looked around the house one last time and whispered, "This place doesn't belong to him anymore." Every brick, every nail, every corner held memories, some sweet, most bitter. I closed my eyes and felt something strange. Not anger, not grief, but release. The decision was cruel, maybe, but sometimes cruelty is the only way to balance injustice. And that night, for the first time in a long time, I slept without guilt. The plan began in silence. I didn't tell anyone, not friends, not neighbors, not even the lawyer who helped me draft the papers until the moment I signed them. It wasn't revenge I was planning. It was justice. The kind of justice that doesn't need shouting or threats. The kind that happens quietly, in the same way my son had quietly left me behind in that hospital bed. The morning after I signed everything away, I woke up before sunrise. The house was cold, and the air smelled of rain. I brewed tea and sat at the kitchen table staring at the papers. My hands rested on them like they were the last pieces of my old life. For a moment, guilt tried to whisper in my ear, that I was being too harsh, too heartless. But then I remembered the IV needle in my arm, the sound of nurses asking if anyone was coming for me, and the image of that empty doorway. That memory silenced every trace of guilt. I decided that day I wouldn't just change my will. I would make sure my son knew why. He would understand, not through arguments, but through loss. The same loss I felt when he forgot me. So I told the lawyer to arrange everything in a way that left no room for confusion. Legal, final, irreversible. The house, the land, the savings, even the insurance benefits would go to the man my son hated most, my former rival. The same man who once offered my son a chance at partnership and was laughed at for being beneath us. That man had shown me more kindness in 1 week than my own son had in 10 years. Over the next few days, I gathered everything that would need to be transferred: bank papers, property titles, receipts. I moved with the calm precision of a man who had already mourned what he was losing. Because truthfully, I wasn't losing anything anymore. I had already lost it all when my son stopped being a son. I made copies of everything and left them in a sealed envelope for the lawyer, labeled clearly in my handwriting, "Execute after notice." It felt strange writing those words, final, cold, but honest. At night, I walked through the house one last time and imagined how it would look when strangers lived there, how my son would react when he realized the locks no longer belonged to him. I pictured his face when he'd learned that his enemy now owned what he once mocked me for protecting. The thought didn't bring joy, it brought balance. Pain had a way of teaching lessons that love couldn't. And I was done teaching him with kindness. I spent the next morning cleaning, not for my son, not for anyone else, for myself. I polished the table, folded my clothes, and packed a small suitcase. I took only what I needed: a few shirts, some photos of my wife, and a framed picture of my son as a child, before greed and pride took over his heart. I left everything else behind: the furniture, the car, the expensive things. None of it mattered anymore. The house was just a building now, not a home. By evening, everything was ready. The lawyer came by to finalize the last signature. I signed slowly, pressing my pen firmly into the paper. It was the end of one life and the start of another. The lawyer looked at me and said, "He'll be angry when he finds out." I nodded and replied, "Then maybe for the first time he'll feel something real." That night, I sat in the garden one last time. The moon was bright and the wind carried the smell of wet earth. I thought of all the birthdays I had spent alone, the calls that never came, the love that was taken for granted. I realized I had been clinging to a ghost, the ghost of a son who existed only in my memories. The man he had become didn't care if I lived or died. So why should I care if he cried over a house? As I looked at the empty windows glowing under the moonlight, I whispered to myself, "He left me in a hospital bed for 3 days. I've left him with 3 words that will haunt him forever. Too late, son." And for the first time in years, I felt free. The reason behind my decision wasn't anger. It was exhaustion, the kind that builds up quietly, year after year, until it becomes heavier than grief. I had forgiven my son for many things before. The missed birthdays, the forgotten calls, the way he spoke to me like I was already gone. I told myself he was busy, that life was hard, that maybe one day he would realize how much I had done for him. But when I lay in that hospital bed alone, staring at the ceiling, I understood something painful. He didn't forget me. He chose not to care. That choice cut deeper than any knife. People think betrayal always comes with shouting, tears, and broken plates. But the worst kind is silent. It happens in small moments. A door that never opens, a phone that never rings, a heart that stops waiting. That was my life for years. I gave him everything, the house, the education, the comfort he never earned. And in return, he gave me absence. Not even hate, just emptiness. That's what made my decision easy. The man I transferred the house to, the one my son despised, wasn't perfect, but he had something my son didn't: loyalty. Years ago, when I was struggling to keep my business alive, when banks refused me and friends vanished, it was that man who helped me. Quietly, without pride, without asking for anything in return. My son mocked me for accepting his help, said I was desperate, said I was embarrassing our family name. He didn't understand that kindness doesn't need blood ties. Sometimes strangers carry more honor than your own kin. That's why I chose him. Not to punish my son, but to reward the kind of man my son refused to become. I remember the day that man, my rival, visited me at the office. My son was there too. The man offered advice, shared contacts, tried to help. My son insulted him, told him to leave, and laughed after he left. I scolded my boy that day, told him that arrogance destroys people faster than failure ever could. He didn't listen. He never did. And when he left me in that hospital, I realized arrogance wasn't just part of him. It was all he had left. That's when I decided to take it away from him piece by piece, starting with the one thing he valued most: this house. The house wasn't just a building. It was my life's work. Every brick, every tile, every nail had a story. My hands bled building it. My wife and I starved some nights just to pay for it. It was supposed to be a symbol of love, a place for family. But after she passed and my son grew colder, it became something else, a cage of memories. He thought he'd inherit it automatically, like it was owed to him. That thought made me sick. Nothing is owed to someone who abandons the hands that fed them. When I met with the lawyer, I told him I wanted everything to go to the rival and his family after I was gone. I wanted someone who knew struggle, who respected hard work, to live here. Someone who would remember the meaning of gratitude. The lawyer looked at me strangely and said, "Are you sure, sir? This will destroy your son." I smiled weakly and said, "He destroyed me first." That night, I stood outside the house again. The wind was cold, and the windows glowed faintly under the moonlight. I imagined my son's face when he'd find out. The confusion, the disbelief, the anger. I didn't enjoy the thought, but it felt right. Sometimes pain is the only teacher strong enough to reach a stubborn heart. And if it takes losing everything for him to understand what love really was, then so be it. The reason I gave the house away wasn't revenge, it was truth. The truth that family means nothing if love isn't there, that a father's heart, no matter how deep, can eventually run dry. I wanted to leave him with one final lesson, that wealth fades, pride collapses, and what remains at the end is how you treated the people who once waited for you to come home. I waited long enough. Now, it was his turn. The revelation came weeks later. I had already moved out, living in a small apartment near the harbor, a quiet place where no one knew my name. The air smelled of salt, and the waves crashed against the rocks like they were trying to wake the dead. I spent most days watching the sea, wondering when he'd find out. I didn't have to wait long. One morning, the lawyer called me. His voice was calm, but I could hear the storm behind it. "He knows," he said simply. "He came to the house." I hung up and closed my eyes. The moment I had prepared for had finally arrived. That afternoon, my phone wouldn't stop ringing. His number appeared again and again, but I didn't answer. I didn't need to hear the words. I already knew what he'd say. The same excuses, the same fake remorse, the same sudden discovery of love that only comes when comfort disappears. I imagined him standing in front of the house, trying to open a door that no longer belonged to him, yelling, cursing, blaming everyone but himself. The house had been handed over 2 days earlier. The deed was signed, sealed, and delivered. Legally, he was nothing more than a stranger now. That night, the lawyer sent me a copy of the documents, stamped and official. The rival, the man my son once called a snake, was now the rightful owner of the property. The same man who had once told me, "You have a good heart, but your kindness will destroy you." Maybe he was right, maybe it already had, but at least now, my kindness had gone to someone who valued it. 2 days later, I received a letter in the mail. No name on the envelope, but I knew the handwriting. It was my son's. The paper was crumpled, the ink smudged in places. His words were angry, desperate, and broken. He accused me of betrayal, of ruining his life, of humiliating him. He said I had chosen a stranger over my own blood. I read the letter slowly, line by line, and smiled sadly. That was the moment I realized the truth. He still didn't understand. He still thought everything was about money, about ownership, about power. He couldn't see that I hadn't chosen a stranger over him. I had chosen decency over greed. In that same envelope, there was something else, a photograph. It was of the two of us, taken years ago when he graduated. His arm was around my shoulder, his smile wide and confident. I stared at that picture for a long time. Back then, I had been proud. I thought I had done everything right, given him opportunity, education, and comfort. But looking at it now, I saw what I had missed. There was no love in his eyes, only pride. The kind that looks down, not across. The next week, I heard from the rival. He called to thank me, said he didn't deserve my trust, but would honor it. He told me he was repairing the old roof and cleaning the garden. I could hear sincerity in his voice, the kind I used to pray for from my son. He even said, "If you ever want to visit the place, it will always be open to you." That one sentence meant more to me than any apology my son could ever make. Because kindness without blood is still kindness. But blood without love is just red water. A month later, I passed by the old neighborhood. My son was there, standing outside the gate of what used to be his home. The rival was on the porch, talking to his workers. My son looked lost, smaller, defeated. I didn't stop. I didn't need to. Everything that needed to be said was already written in silence. He looked up for a moment, and our eyes met. I didn't see hate. I saw confusion, maybe regret. But it was too late. I drove away. The revelation wasn't just that he'd lost the house. It was that he'd never had it to begin with. The house, the comfort, the inheritance. They were never his by right. They were gifts, given out of love. And when love dies, gifts turn to dust. He thought he'd lost everything, but what he really lost was me. The fallout came fast and loud. My son couldn't accept that I had done it. Within days, he called everyone we knew, neighbors, friends, old business partners, trying to turn them against me. He said I'd gone mad, that I was manipulated, that my mind was failing. But the truth was sharp, solid, and written in ink. The law didn't care about his excuses. The signatures were mine. The house was gone. The decision was final. The same man who once laughed at my weakness was now learning what real power looked like. Power wrapped in calm, not in cruelty. He showed up at my apartment 2 weeks later. I didn't open the door. I heard his voice through the wood, trembling with anger. He shouted, he begged, he even cried. But not once did he say he was sorry for leaving me alone in that hospital bed. All his words were about the house, the inheritance, the money. Every sentence began with "you took" and ended with "mine." That was when I knew for sure I had done the right thing. A son who values property over people doesn't deserve either. For days after that, he kept calling, sending messages filled with rage. He wanted me to meet, to talk, to fix it. I didn't respond. I had nothing left to fix. The damage wasn't in the papers or the walls. It was in his heart, and I couldn't repair what greed had destroyed. Friends told me to forgive him. They said he was young, that blood was thicker than pride. But blood means nothing when it runs cold. Forgiveness only works when there's regret, and my son didn't regret losing me. He regretted losing the house. Then came the news that broke whatever was left of my pity. The rival, now the new owner, told me my son had tried to break into the house one night. He had been caught on camera, screaming that it was his, throwing stones at the gate. The police came but didn't arrest him. The rival didn't press charges. Instead, he told them, "He's just a lost boy trying to get back what he threw away." When he called to tell me that, I felt something strange. Not pride, not satisfaction, just a deep, hollow sadness. My son was falling apart, and it wasn't my fault anymore. A week later, I saw him by accident. He was sitting on a bench near the old market, head down, clothes wrinkled, eyes swollen. He didn't notice me. I stood across the street and watched him for a long time. People passed him without looking. The same man who once walked with his head high, who mocked everyone he thought was beneath him, was now invisible. I wanted to go to him. I wanted to put my hand on his shoulder and tell him I still loved him. But my legs didn't move. Love had turned into something heavy that I couldn't carry anymore. I turned away. After that, the calls stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the shouting. I would sit by the window some nights, staring at my phone, half hoping it would ring. It never did. I thought about reaching out, but then I remembered those 3 days in the hospital. The nurses had asked if anyone was coming for me, and I had lied. I told them my son was busy with work, that he'd come soon. I lied because I wanted to believe he still cared. That lie still hurts more than anything. The rival visited me one evening to bring some papers I'd forgotten. He said the house was being restored, the garden blooming again. I thanked him. As he left, he said something that stayed with me. Sometimes we lose our children long before we bury them. I didn't respond, but he was right. I had lost my son the day he stopped seeing me as a father and started seeing me as a wallet. Now, the house stands tall again, but it no longer belongs to my blood. It belongs to someone who knows what loyalty means. And my son? He has everything money can't buy: pride, anger, and loneliness. The same things that destroyed him. The fallout wasn't just his, it was ours. I lost a child, but I gained my peace. And in the quiet that followed, I finally learned, sometimes justice doesn't shout. It simply signs its name and walks away. Now I live far from that house, in a small flat where the walls are plain and the silence feels clean. I wake up early, make my own coffee, and sit by the window facing the sea. There is peace here, not joy, but peace. I no longer wait for calls, no longer check the door expecting footsteps that never come. I learned that love, when one-sided, becomes a slow poison. It eats you from the inside while you keep smiling, pretending you're fine. I spent years feeding that poison, calling it patience, calling it fatherhood. But patience without respect is just slow dying. Sometimes I still see my son in dreams. He's small again, running through the fields, his laughter filling the air. I wake up with tears, but not because I miss the boy, because I know that boy is gone. The man he became is a stranger, shaped by greed and pride, not by the love I gave him. It hurts to admit that some children outgrow their parents, not in wisdom but in arrogance. They see kindness as weakness, sacrifice as debt. That's what happened to him. That's what broke us. I visit the harbor most evenings. The people there know me only as the old man who feeds the birds. They don't know the story. They don't know the sun. I prefer it that way. When they smile, it's without pity. They talk to me like a person, not a relic. I've learned that strangers can give more warmth than family sometimes. One fisherman brings me bread, another shares his radio. They remind me of something my life once had, simple decency. I heard from the lawyer recently. The rival, the man who now owns my house, has turned it into a shelter for veterans and widows. The garden is open, the rooms are full of life again. When I heard that, I smiled for the first time in months. The place that once held betrayal now holds purpose. Maybe that's the only justice that matters, to turn pain into something that helps someone else. My son wanted that house for pride. Now it feeds people who have nothing. I couldn't have written a better ending. Do I miss him? Every day. No matter how deep the wound, a father's heart still remembers the child, not the man. I still pray for him, quietly, every night. I ask life to be gentle with him, even when he wasn't gentle with me. But I don't wish for him to come back. Some doors, once closed, should stay closed. I gave him everything, and when he walked away, I gave him one final gift. The truth. That comfort without compassion is worthless. That money can buy walls, but not peace. That a man who abandons his father will one day find himself abandoned by the world. When I walk by the sea, I sometimes imagine him standing beside me, older now, wiser maybe, asking why I did it. I would tell him I didn't do it to hurt him. I did it so he would finally see what I had seen all along. That love is not a right, it's a responsibility. That being family isn't about blood, it's about loyalty. That leaving someone in a hospital bed for 3 days isn't forgetfulness, it's betrayal. And betrayal has a price, always. I don't live with hate. Hate keeps you chained to the same pain forever. I live with acceptance. The kind that doesn't erase the scars but stops you from bleeding. I look at my life now, small, quiet, honest, and I feel something I never felt in that big house. Freedom. I may have lost my son, my wealth, my name, but I found myself again. That's enough. One evening, as the sun sinks into the water, I whisper the last words I'll ever say about him. I loved you more than my life. You turned that love into dust. But even dust, when the wind carries it, still travels far. Maybe someday, my love will reach you again, not as wealth, not as inheritance, but as the lesson you never learned. And with that, I stand, watch the horizon fade, and walk home, slowly. Alone, yes, but no longer broken.